overnight, LifeSite News published a translation of an article from an Italian outlet called L'Espresso. The article levels an accusation against Pope Francis that eerily mirrors the accusation leveled against him in the cover-up of the McCarrick case. If this is true, and if the McCarrick cover-up allegations are true, then what we have here is the beginning of a pattern of behavior. The presence of a pattern is essential for leveling allegations against the Pope of the toleration or even having made common cause with the Lavender Mafia, as a pattern of behavior indicates far more than mere toleration of evil. There are those beginning to ask the hard question of whether Francis is himself a homo heretic, and not just someone who will tolerate what should be intolerable in the episcopate. In addition, another story broke yesterday, also involving his time in Argentina, that points to the emergence of a pattern of behavior. The first is from LifeSite News. A quick note. The author spends a fair amount of time summarizing the McCarrick issue. I'm going to skip all of that and go right to the new allegations. Pope Francis didn't just cover up for McCarrick. It's worse than that. The McCarrick case is not the only one of its kind that has gotten Jorge Mario Bergoglio into trouble. There is another one that looks like its exact twin. It concerns Monsignor Battista Rico, director of the Casa Santa Marta, selected by Francis as his residence, whom he promoted on June 15, 2013, at the beginning of his pontificate, as prelate of the IOR, meaning the Pope's contact at the Vatican Bank, with the right to attend all of the board meetings and to access all of the documentation. During the second half of that month of June 2013, the ambassadors from all over the world had gathered in Rome, and it was on that occasion that Vigano, nuncio in Washington at the time, met with Francis and told him about McCarrick's misconduct. But even the appointment of Rica as prelate of the IOR, which had taken place a few days before, had created quite a bit of distress among a good number of the nuncios, who had known him as a diplomatic advisor in Algeria, Colombia, Switzerland, and then Uruguay, everywhere displaying conduct that was anything but chaste, especially at his last destination. In Montevideo, between 1999 and 2001, Rica cohabited with his lover, former Swiss Army Captain Patrick Hari, who had followed him there from Bern, and he also frequented cruising spots with young men, getting beaten up one time and another, getting stuck in an elevator at the nunciature with an 18-year-old already known to the Uruguayan police. Rica ended up being removed from diplomatic service in the field and recalled to Rome, where miraculously his career became a success all over again, turning him into a diplomatic advisor of the first class within the structure of the Secretariat of State, and above all director of the 3 Vatican residences for cardinals and bishops visiting Rome, including that of Santa Marta, with the opportunity to establish excellent relationships, including friendships, with churchmen of half the world, including Bergoglio, who, as soon as he was elected pope, admitted him into his most intimate circle, where he still remains today. So then, among the nuncios gathered in Rome during that month of June 2013, there were also those who knew about Rica's scandalous background and thought that Francis was not aware of it, considering his promotion of this character a few days before to nothing less than the prelate of the IOR, the Vatican Bank. So there were those who, during those days, wanted to put Francis on guard by informing him about Rica's record. Not only that, among the numerous witnesses of Rica's scandalous conduct in Montevideo were some of the Uruguayan bishops, one of whom, after Rica was appointed prelate of the IOR, felt it his duty to write an anguished letter in which he asked him, for the love of the Pope and of the Church, to resign. And in effect, Francis wanted to see clear documentation of Rica's record while he was at the nunciature of Montevideo. He had it sent to Rome through his own personal channels, without going through the Secretariat of State. In the meantime, in L'Espresso, a very detailed article on Rica had come out, who did not react at all publicly, while in private he dismissed as gossip all those facts reported against him, and made sure to make it known to the Pope, with whom he had met, also considered it gossip devoid of any foundation. Interviewed in July of 2013 by the Uruguayan and Argentine press about the prelate's fate, the nuncio to Montevideo at the time, Guido Anselmo Pecorari, limited himself to this laconic statement: "I maintain that the question is in the hands of the Holy See, and surely the Holy Father in his wisdom will know what to do." The fact is that at the end of the month of July, during the press conference on the flight back to Rome from Rio de Janeiro, where he had gone for World Youth Day, Pope Francis was in effect questioned by a Brazilian journalist on the Rica case and the gay lobby. And this was his actual reply, transcribed as such in the official bulletin of the Holy See. And you will remember this statement because it became infamous right after his accession to the See of Peter. Quote, "About Monsignor Rica, I did what canon law calls for. That is a preliminary investigation. And from this investigation, there was nothing of what had been alleged. We did not find anything of that. This is the response. But I wish to add something else. I see that many times in the church, over and above this case, but including this case, people search for sins from youth, for example, and then publish them. They are not crimes, right? Crimes are something different. The abuse of minors is a crime. No, sins. But if a person, whether it be a lay person, a priest, or a religious sister, commits a crime and then converts, the Lord forgives. And when the Lord forgives, the Lord forgets. And this is a very important thing for our lives. When we confess our sins and we truly say, I have sinned in this, the Lord forgets. And so we have no right not to forget, because otherwise we would run the risk of the Lord of not forgetting our sins. That is a danger. This is important, a theology of sin. Many times I think of St. Peter. He committed one of the worst sins, that he denied Christ. And even with this sin, they made him pope. We have to think a great deal about that. But returning to your question more concretely, in this case, I conducted a preliminary investigation and we didn't find anything. This is the first question. Then you spoke about the gay lobby. So much is written about the gay lobby. I still haven't found anyone with an identity card in the Vatican with gay on it. They say there are some there. I believe that when you're dealing with such a person, you must distinguish between the fact of a person being gay and the fact of someone forming a lobby, because not all lobbies are good. This one is not good. If someone is gay and searching for the Lord and has goodwill, then who am I to judge him? The Catechism of the Catholic Church explains this in a beautiful way, saying, wait for a moment, how does it say it? It says, no one should marginalize these people for this. They must be integrated into society. The problem is not having this tendency. No, we must be brothers and sisters to one another, and there is this one and there is that one. The problem is making a lobby of this tendency. A lobby of misers, a lobby of politicians, a lobby of masons, so many lobbies. For me, this is the greater problem. Thank you so much for this question. 3 observations about what Pope Francis said here. 1. In maintaining that he had found nothing worthy of blame in the investigation preceding Rica's appointment as prelate of the IOR, Francis confirmed that the personal dossier on him that was kept at the Secretariat of State had been carefully scrubbed of his scandalous past. But in the preceding weeks, Francis also had available to him the accusatory documentation kept at the Nunciature of Montevideo, incontrovertible documentation, seeing that on the basis of it the Secretariat of State had withdrawn Rica from diplomatic service in the field, and yet he ignored it. 2. Francis applied to Rica the typology of those who have committed, quote, sins of the youth, quote, and then have repented. But this is never the image of himself that Rica has presented, rather that of one who has always rejected as baseless gossip the accusations against his conduct. And 3, it was in reference to none other than Rica that Francis pronounced the famous phrase that has become the trademark of his pontificate. If someone is gay and is searching for the Lord and has goodwill, then who am I to judge him? With this phrase, Bergoglio reversed completely to his favor in world public opinion, an affair that had otherwise could have seriously undermined his credibility. This is the feat that Pope Francis is again attempting today after the McCarrick affair has been laid bare by ex-nuncio Viganio. There is also this story, again from LifeSite News, that alleges that Pope Francis, when he was known as Cardinal Bergoglio, covered up allegations of sex abuse by priests when he was the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires. I won't read the article in full. As with all articles I cite, a link will be found on the blog, which is where I list all of my sources, and the link for that is in the description below. Francis ignored, covered up abuse in Argentina before becoming Pope, documentary finds. German national TV channel ZDF is rerunning a documentary produced last year that claims that Pope Francis, as Archbishop Bergoglio of Buenos Aires, ignored cries for justice from abuse victims in his diocese. The documentary is now gaining traction in the fallout of Archbishop Viganio's testimony, that the Pope covered up the abuse of now ex-Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. The documentary also claims that then Archbishop Bergoglio, prior to becoming the Pope, participated in the unsuccessful defense of a priest accused of abuse. That priest has now been imprisoned for 15 years after he was found guilty of sexually abusing children. Now, in light of the Viganò report, the documentary by Martin Boudreau has been aired again and is now making the rounds in the German-speaking world. The documentary, titled The Silence of the Shepherds, won the 2017 Prix Europa for Best European Documentaries. It is available in the U.S. under the title Sex Abuse in the Church, The Code of Silence. The documentary makes the case that many priests accused of sexual abuse were merely transferred by their bishops to other countries so as to avoid prosecution. The second half of the documentary highlights Archbishop Jorge Bergoglio's own conduct in Buenos Aires. The film quotes a 2010 book titled in French, I'm not going to read that in French, it's the English title, On Heaven and Earth, written by both Jorge Bergoglio and Rabbi Abraham Skorka. In this book, Bergoglio stated that in his diocese there were no pedophile priests, according to the film. LifeSite News found that specific quote on page 50 of the English version. Here is what Jorge Bergoglio as Archbishop says when speaking about pedophile priests. Now, when it happens, you can never turn a blind eye. You cannot be in a position of power and destroy the life of another person. In my diocese, it never happened to me, Bergoglio added. He then described what counsel he once gave to a fellow bishop who had such a case. I told him to take away the priest's faculties, not to permit him to exercise his priestly ministry again, and to initiate a canonical trial. When Bergoglio became Pope Francis in 2013, he appears to have ignored his own advice. This is evidenced in the case of known child molester Father Mario Inzoli, whom the Pope, against the advice of Cardinal Gerhard Müller, reinstated, giving back to him some of his priestly faculties. The documentary reveals, however, how Bergoglio himself, when writing his 2010 book, had indeed had such a case of a pedophile priest in a neighboring diocese and that he was intimately involved in the case. It is the now infamous Father Julio Cesar Grassi, who has been in prison for 15 years because of his abuse of children who were entrusted to his care in the Happy Children Foundation orphanage. The documentary highlighted 6 alleged victims of abuse who all claimed that then Archbishop Bergoglio never answered their own specific complaints when they wrote to him as the Archbishop of Buenos Aires. When asked by the documentary journalists whether or not they ever received an answer, they all shook their heads in the negative. Asked about the above-quoted statement that Bergoglio never having a pedophile priest in his diocese, and whether he says here the truth, one abuse victim, a woman, answered, he wants people to believe that, but it is a lie. Despite contacting the future pope with allegations against abusive priests, none of us received an answer, was the reply by one abuse victim. He receives all the celebrities like Leonardo DiCaprio, continued a woman, but for us, not even a quick letter to say he was sorry. A couple of things here. If these allegations are true, then we see a pattern of behavior. On at least 3 occasions, Pope Francis has covered up the criminal abuse of minors by priests and bishops and lied about or at least engaged in overt obfuscation when confronted by the media. It is time to ask ourselves some serious questions. If this is a real pattern of behavior, then why is Francis asking us to respond with silence and prayer? Why is both the secular media and the establishment Catholic media defending him with such ferocity? And in an indictment against ourselves, why did it take so long for so many of us to take a stand against these abuses? Most of these allegations are not new at all. The allegations from Argentina date to before his election as Pope. It's time for a long, hard bit of introspection. I'll agree with Francis's defenders on this much. We share in the blame. We allowed ourselves to become worldly, to not pay enough attention to the situation in the church. The crisis in the church is nothing new. It has its roots in at least the Second Vatican Council, if not before. By the end of the week, I hope to have part 2 of my video on the origins of the crisis in the church up for viewing. In part 1, I spoke of the historic fact of the communist infiltration of the church, a fact backed up by the congressional testimony given it in the 1950s by Bella Dodd. In part 2, I will go into detail about an enemy that is tied to communism but predates it by at least 700 years. Stay tuned. Viva Cristo Rey.